First, I want to thank you all for coming out. My name is Stephen. I'm an addiction psychiatrist by education, and my PhD is in neuroscience. So it's really kind of exciting for me to come up here. I'm from Long Island, so as far as I'm concerned, I'm upstate. This to me is like, I told my friends I'm going upstate, and they're like, oh, you're going upstate. So I'm from West Hampton, way on the east end of Long Island, so it's kind of exciting for me to be upstate. But I just learned, I guess I'm not upstate. But anyway, thank you for coming. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the research I do in the field of substance abuse. I'm not here to beat people up on drugs and just say no to drugs and drugs are bad. I do research in the field of substance abuse. And I've been doing it for almost 40 years. Volunteers who come to our center are kids who are addicted to different drugs. And we image their brain, and I'll show you, to try and understand the disease of addiction. And I just want to show you what I see. This morning I was in an elementary school in Mineola with fifth graders, and we did 2 hours of questions. So I'm really laid back. If you have any questions, ask. You don't wait to the end. Ask whatever you want to ask. If you have a question, if I say something you don't understand, raise your hand and ask. So, just to give you some background, I went to college in Jersey, medical school in the Midwest, residency in Stony Brook on the island, and then I went right into research because I've always been interested in research. And I've always been interested in the effects of addictive drugs in the human brain for a whole bunch of reasons. I lost both of my parents to alcoholism. My brother's an alcoholic. I don't drink, not because I'm a saint, but because I know that there's a genetic predisposition to the disease. I see it, I live it with my patients. So I just have been fascinated by the effects of addictive drugs on the human brain. And for a really long time, we didn't know a whole lot about it. Well, now we know a whole lot about it. We know it's a disease. We see it in people before it shows up. My youngest patients, just to kind of give you a sense, my youngest patients are 9 years old. I have 90 fourth graders who are drinking a quart of gin a day. I have 125 seventh graders. These are kids who are 11 and 12 who are injecting heroin every day. So the reason I say that is because 20 years ago, my patients, the average age, was between 18 and 26, 25. Today, if I see a high school senior, that's an old kid. My patients now are 5th grade to 10th and 11th. So what's happened is ages have shifted. It's now much more an issue in middle school than it is in high school. And we'll talk about why that is, and I'll show you some data. So what I do is simple science, and I will make this simple science as simple as I can. If I say anything you don't understand, just stop me and say, I don't understand what you're saying, and I'll do my best to explain. Okay, so everybody who comes to me, I'm now at NYU, anybody who comes to me comes as a volunteer. It's no different than any research program in any disease, right? There are programs in breast cancer, lupus, and Alzheimer's disease, and diabetes, right? It's a classic research protocol. I just happen to be interested in substance abuse, so everyone who comes as a volunteer. No one comes because they have to. No one comes because they're mandated. Every person who comes to me, and we get thousands a year, come as a volunteer to participate in our research effort to understand what's going on in the human brain as a consequence of drug abuse, virtually every drug that people abuse, and the effects on abstinence. If you use a drug for 5 years and quit, what happens? If you used a drug 50 years ago, what happens? If you used a drug today, what happens? That's the kind of stuff we do. So, one of the things that you should know is that every school district on Long Island, many school districts up here, have kids who have volunteered for our program. So, the reason I say that is there might be scans from kids in this district. You should know that just up front. You won't see any names, you won't see any faces, but what you'll see is what you should know is this disease is hitting every school district Doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter if it's wealthy or poor, doesn't matter ethnicity, it's hitting across the board, and I'll show you. So, the way I do my work is by imaging. So everybody is familiar, or I'm sure all of you in this room are familiar with the conventional imaging techniques of CT, X-ray, and MRI. There isn't a hospital in the US that doesn't have these three imaging tools. Now they're very powerful, they're very helpful, they're nothing more than fancy cameras that allow us to take pictures of the human body, how it appears. So this is a CAT scan, it stands for computerized axial tomography of someone's abdomen. These are tumors in the liver. This is an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging of a young girl. Her eyes are right here. These little white spots are a disease called MS, multiple sclerosis. And this is a compound fracture of the forearm in a young kid in a car accident. The point here is that you're all familiar with the conventional imaging techniques. These are tools, cameras that take pictures of what your body looks like. And they are incredibly powerful. But if you think about a disease, any disease you can think of, doesn't matter what it is, every single disease in the human body is a consequence of a change in how your body lives, not how your body looks. Now, as a disease progresses, how your body looks might change. Right? As this disease of cancer progresses, the tumors get big enough to see them. As a disease like obesity progresses, you can see a change. But in the first stage of any disease, and every disease, is a functional change. So, to make this really simple, these are anatomical imaging techniques. They take pictures of anatomy. We need a physiologic imaging technique, or a functional imaging technique, one that shows us how the body lives, not how the body looks. Well, that technique is called positron emission tomography, PET scans. The first PET scanner was made in 1960 at Brookhaven National Lab, where I worked for 25 years. It's a functional imaging technique. It shows us not how your body looks, but how your body lives. So, that's incredibly important because it allows me to see diseases, in many cases, years before you become symptomatic, right? How do we become symptomatic for cancer? Well, two ways, really. You feel a mass, or you become symptomatic of a mass. Well, either way, by the time you feel one, or by the time you have a behavior consistent with one, it's substantial. Imagine if you could see cancer if it's a single cell. Imagine if I can see cancer 2 years before you can feel a mass. That's what PET does. PET allows me to see changes in function, in many cases years before they produce a change that we can perceive. So PET has this enormously powerful ability to image the body, the entire body, and look at how your body is living. So, where you'll run into PET scanning now is in the cancer world. It's the #1 diagnostic tool for cancer for a whole bunch of reasons. But one, it shows us the disease before you ever become symptomatic. Well, that begs the question, if I'm not symptomatic and I don't feel a mass, why the hell would I go get a PET scan? Well, what if your mom had breast cancer? What if your dad had prostate cancer? What if there's colon cancer in your family, right? So there's a lot of genetic reasons to go get pre-scanned with a technique that sees cancer before you're ever symptomatic. So, PET scans are really simple to read. They're in color. They're in color because it's easier for me to tell you to look at a red spot than it is to look at a spot that's more gray than another spot. So this is what you're going to see. You'll see a bunch of PET scans. You should know these are all done in real time. Patients come to us and we take a picture. We get a picture in 8 minutes. So these images that you see are images that were taken and produced in real time. The image is produced as the patient is laying there getting scanned. To read a PET scan, all you do is remember 3rd grade when you learned about rainbow, Roy G. Biv. Red is one extreme of a rainbow, violet is the other. Well, we just translate those colors into function. So when you look at a PET scan and you see areas that are red, that part of the brain is really, really active. It's doing a lot. Yellows and greens, much less active. Blues and blacks, not active at all. So, it's really simple. If I put you in a PET scanner and I put a tennis ball in your left hand, and I have you squeeze that tennis ball for 8 minutes, that's what a scan takes. At the end of the scan, I'm going to see the part of your brain that runs your left hand. Well, so we can play all kinds of games. I can tickle your foot, I can tickle your ear, I can see what part of your brain is. Well, we can also do a lot of things that are a lot more interesting. We do a lot of work with pain because of the whole opiate thing and what's going on with opiate addiction. So we're trying to get an understanding of pain. So we get a metabolic signature of pain. I can put you in pain, and I can see how your brain responds to pain. And we do this all the time. We use the standard pain model, which is putting your hand in a bucket of ice water, and I can see how your brain responds to pain. Well, once I get a metabolic signature of pain, what pain looks like in your brain, now I can give you medication for that pain, and I can dose you at a level that treats the pain but doesn't produce the addiction. So we can start to do things that are like this that are fascinating because they let us look at things like anxiety. We make people anxious. We scare people. We make people happy. We let people watch movies they like. We let people watch movies they don't like. So we kind of get a really good metabolic signature of behavior. So a PET scan you'll see of someone who's depressed is very different than a PET scan of someone who isn't. So now I've got this amazing tool that lets me see a disease before I even talk to the patient. So when you look at these PET scans, you'll have no trouble interpreting. Here are 3 PET scans from 3 normal people, but they're obviously really different. On the left is a 5-day-old baby. So this just speaks to the notion, something we all know. There isn't anyone in this room, despite what I heard this morning, that can remember being born. I had a kid tell me this morning, like I always do, oh, I remember being, Dr. Drew, I remember being born. It was dark, and all of a sudden it was light. You know, you're a 5th grade kid, you can't remember being born. You think of an idiot? So, you can't remember being born because your brain doesn't have the metabolic machinery when you're 5 days old to store a memory. In the middle is my son when he was 6. 6-year-old brains, you know 6-year-olds. 6-year-olds are a nightmare, right? They're an absolute nightmare. They pick on the dog, they pull the dog's tail, it picks on his sister, right? The 6-year-old brain is a very metabolically active brain. This is what we all have to look forward to. This is someone about in their mid-30s, and I know. As we get older, our brain becomes less active. That's normal. Now, if you want to feel better about it, this person can do a lot more with his brain than a 6-year-old can. So one of the ways it makes you feel better, think about it, is we just become more efficient. Our brains slow down as we age, which is normal, but we can do more with it. So that says something else. Metabolic rate has nothing to do with intellect. It has nothing to do with one's ability to do anything. The beauty of the brain is that it uses energy in the form of sugar, like a car uses gasoline, and the way the car functions is independent, for the most part, of the gasoline it consumes. Just like the brain, the energy it consumes is independent of intellect. So you don't look at a PET scan and say, that kid's smarter than that. Has nothing to do with intellect, it's brain metabolism. So really simple, but the reason I'm showing you age is really twofold. One, I want you to see how sensitive the instrument is. I can see very little and I can see a whole lot, that's important. But 2, it says something that's really important in my business, and that is that age matters. When I show you a 12-year-old who's abusing methamphetamine, and I've got more than I can count, I have to compare that to a 12-year-old who isn't. When I show you a 4th grader or 9-year-old alcoholic, I will show you a 4th grader who isn't. So everything that we do, we scan against or compare to age-matched controls because age makes a huge difference. Okay, if you've never seen a PET scanner, here it is. I'd like to tell you that it's really impressive. It's not. It's just a big box with a hole in it. Our volunteers, this is a whole body machine lying on this bed, and we can scan them head to toe. If you've had an MRI scan, they can be noisy. PET scans, no noise. PET scans are silent. You don't know the machine's on. The machine actually runs all the time. So it takes about 8 minutes for a typical PET scan. Some can take longer, but the typical ones are about 8. Okay, so if we're going to understand this disease of addiction, we need to understand a little bit about what causes it. So everyone in this room, everyone on the planet has a chemical chemical in their brain called dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical your brain makes. Its primary role in your life is movement. Every time you move anything, you blink an eyelid, you move a hand, a finger, you expand your chest to breathe, your heart beats. Anytime you move, your brain has to release dopamine to allow that to happen. Dopamine is the chemical that allows you to move. Well, then that makes sense that if you lose it, you run into troubles moving. Well, the most common disease is Parkinson's. You've all probably heard of Parkinson's disease. Muhammad Ali is the one that kids know. If you saw him right up shortly before he died, he couldn't even speak because his disease was so bad. I'm going to date myself and tell you that I happen to like, what's the singer? Sweet Carolina. Neil Diamond, thank you. You see, he's retired, he's no longer traveling because he's got Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is a disease that's characterized by a loss of brain dopamine. So dopamine is a chemical your brain makes that allows you to move. Unfortunately, it's a chemical that I can't give you. I could back up a truckload of dopamine and pour it down your throat and none of it would get in your brain. Because the brain is very selective about the compounds it lets get in. Dopamine is one it doesn't. So if you start to lose dopamine, there's not a whole lot I can do. I can't give you dopamine. I can't put it in a pill, in a needle, in a drink. It doesn't get across the blood-brain barrier. It doesn't get across into your brain. What I can do, and what we do is we give drugs that your brain uses to make dopamine, L-Dopa, and that will increase your dopamine levels a little bit, and that works for a little while, but it's not a sustainable thing. So, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that allows you to move. The other thing it does is it allows you to feel happy and sad. So I'm going to make this really simple. If you're happy from a natural reward, you're with your kids, you're with your spouse, Friday afternoon, I happen to be a New England Patriots fan. I was bummed this year, but last year, when they came from behind and won, I was really happy. My son is a Jets fan. I don't know why. But when I'm happy from when the Patriots win, when I'm with my kids, I'm happy. When you're happy, when you feel pleasure, happy from a natural reward, your brain dopamine levels will go up between 5 and 6%. If you're sad from something, loss of a pet, loss of a spouse, something tragic happens, you'll lose about 5 or 6%. Well, that tells us something that's really important. And that is, because dopamine is so vital for your ability to maintain your ability to move, which after all is how you're going to feed yourself and water yourself, the brain keeps a really tight limit on the amount of dopamine it releases. So a 5% increase when you're happy is a big deal. A 5% decrease when you're sad is a big deal. Your brain keeps a very tight lid on the amount of dopamine it will release. Now, every addictive drug that we've ever studied works by increasing brain dopamine. That's how they work. You take heroin, dopamine goes up. You take caffeine, dopamine goes up. You take alcohol, cocaine, ecstasy, spice, whatever it is. Every addictive drug works by increasing brain dopamine. Now it's all about perspective. So in a school setting, a kid comes into class one day and gets a 95, or she gets a 95 on a math test. He or she is thrilled. 5% increase in brain dopamine. They're ecstatic. Now they want to celebrate that 95%. They go across the street and they use methamphetamine. Methamphetamine's in every school district on Long Island and in New York. They get a 95 on a math test, they get a 5% increase in brain dopamine. They walk out the building, go across the street, use a couple of milligrams of methamphetamine, and their dopamine levels go up between 950,000 and 1.2 million times. So addictive drugs raise dopamine levels over 1 million times greater than a natural reward will. So that tells us a lot. One, it allows you to get some perspective on what people feel. Think about the happiest you've ever been, and multiply that by 1 million, 1.5 million. Next, it also tells us why it's so addictive. I mean, people who get rewards of 100,000% increase in dopamine, 200,000%, it's not surprising that it's so addictive. Well, so then that begs the question, if you can use an addictive drug and you can get a 200,000% increase, why aren't we all addicts? Everyone on this planet, for the most part, when you get to a certain age, has used some addictive drug, if you consider that sugar is a drug and everybody's had sugar. So, the question then becomes, we understand the neurotransmitter that causes the disease, we understand how drugs work, we know where they work, and we know what to look for. The question is, how come some kids get addicted and some kids don't? Well, so the first thing we do is we go and we look at and establish a relationship between the effect of brain dopamine and addictive drugs, and we come out with a very simple relationship that says, to the degree that a drug raises dopamine, that tells us how addictive it is. Methamphetamine, that'll do it 1,000,000 times, is more addictive than caffeine, which will do it 100 times. Opiates will do it between 600 and 800,000 times, so opiates are not as addictive as meth, but they're far more addictive than caffeine. So, we now have a very well-established relationship that tells us the degree to which a drug raises dopamine tells us how addictive it is. So now we know what drugs to look for most commonly, and we know what kind of effect we should see. So the question then is, how come some kids get addicted and some kids don't? So over the years, about the last 20, we've gone across the United States to school districts not unlike this, asking kids a really simple question. And the kids started at 6th grade up until seniors in high school. And you just go and you ask them one simple question. How many of you in the room, I'm not asking, you ask how many of you in the room will try anything once? And it's not just chemicals, it's the newest roller coaster, the fastest roller coaster, bungee jumping, hot air balloons, bungee jumping out of hot air balloons, hang gliding, right? Risk-taking behavior. You know these kids, they call themselves adrenaline junkies. And how many of you won't? So you get populations, it's not hard, you get thousands of them. You get kids who self-identify as risk takers, novelty seeking, and you get the kids who aren't. Well, so then what you do is you put them in a PET scanner and you look and see is there any difference. Are the kids different in any way? And lo and behold, what you find, this is about 1,100 kids on the left and 1,100 kids on the right, eyes are right up here. This is a PET scan looking at brain dopamine. I can put you in a PET scanner and I can measure your brain dopamine. I can tell you how much dopamine you have. Then I can give you an addictive drug and watch it change your brain. So we do this kind of stuff all the time, so it's now routine. And what we found is something that was fascinating, and that is, these two groups of kids, you can't tell them apart looking at them. If you ask them a simple question, how many of you are novelty seeking and how many of you aren't, you'll separate them out, that's easy. But now, lo and behold, what we see is the kids who self-report that they're willing to try something novel have about 5% more dopamine in their brain than kids who don't. Well, so this was interesting and never been shown before. We now are able to see a neurochemical change in kids who their only identifier is, they say, yeah, I want to go on a roller coaster. One kid says, nah, I don't want to go on a roller coaster. Well, so we didn't know if it meant anything, if it was random, if it was just dumb luck. So then you do the obvious experiment. You take these two groups of kids who have a very different dopamine level, and then the quantitative difference between the two is about 5%. These guys have about 5% more in their brain than these guys. You put them in a PET scanner and you give them an addictive drug. So you put the kids in the PET scanner, you get a baseline dopamine measure, and then you give them a shot glass of alcohol. Right? Alcohol changes brain dopamine, targets brain dopamine addictive drug. And what you find is the kids on the left get an increase in brain dopamine of about 930%. It's a lot, right? The most you can get it up normally is 5 or 6%. So they take a shot glass of alcohol, 930%. These kids who do the same thing, their dopamine levels go up 36,000%. So here we have the first insight into the disease. These are kids that have no history of drug abuse. These are kids who don't look any different from one another. They don't report anything different, except some of them are a little more novelty-seeking than the others. Well, when you are a novelty-seeking individual, or you have a personality consistent with novelty-seeking, adrenaline, they call themselves adrenaline junkies, you have a dopamine system that's a little more active than the kid sitting next to you who's the same age. In other words, there's a distinct quantitative real, measurable, reproducible difference in the amount of dopamine that exists in the brains of some kids compared to others. And when you use an addictive substance, the kid who's got the potentiated or the enhanced system has a response that's 35,000 times greater than the other. Well, so now that speaks directly to the disease nature of this problem. These aren't kids who hung out with the wrong kids. These aren't kids who weren't breastfed long enough. These aren't kids who, who went down some dark road at night. These are kids that you can't tell them apart. So it speaks to the neurochemical nature of this disease, that it pre-exists in people who have it, and when they use an addictive substance, they unmask it. Well, so that data set was pretty interesting, and it was exciting to us, and we reproduced it over 1,000 times. Then we met with epidemiologists. Epidemiologists are people who go out and look at the number of people who have a disease. Well, if you look at the US, the incidence of chemical dependency in the US is about 14%. 14% is a really big number if you think there's 330 million people in the US, so 14% is a big number, but it's 86% don't have it. Well, then the question is, what's the percentage of kids who would report this? Turns out it's about 7%. Well, so there's a striking discrepancy. I've got a disease that predicts about 14%, but I can find 7 of them. So where are the other 7? They're right here. These are kids who have a disease called ADD or ADHD. Now the hallmark sign of a kid who's got ADD or ADHD is low brain dopamine. Here's normal control, eyes are on the top. Here's our normal dopamine levels. Dopamine exists in 2 parts of the brain called the corpus striatum. That's the areas of red. These kids have low brain dopamine. In fact, how do we treat it? We give drugs that raise dopamine. We give Ritalin, we give Adderall. These are drugs that raise brain dopamine. So it makes perfect sense. We've got a bunch of kids who have a little too much dopamine, adrenaline junkies. And now we've got these kids who have a little too little dopamine, and they manifest with ADD or ADHD. Well, so then you do the exact same thing, 900 and change % increase here, 36,000 and change here. So now we have a much more compelling story, and certainly a more complete one, and that is, the disease of addiction is resident in the brains of people who have it before they do anything that's addictive. If the disease is present, and it manifests either in too much dopamine or too little, then when you use an addictive substance, you unmask it. Well, that's not unlike diabetes. 3/4 of diabetics, the number is estimated that 3/4 of diabetics have the disease because they're overweight. What does that mean? That means when you're normal weight, you're managing diabetes. Your system's working fine, but when you gain a little too much weight, you unmask diabetes. So it's not, the fact that you unmask the disease of addiction is not unique. It's consistent, in fact, with many diseases. Now we just know exactly what's going on. We know that the disease of addiction is one that is resident in the brains of people who have it. That when they use an addictive substance, they get addicted to the drug far faster than the kids who don't. It doesn't mean that if you have a normal dopamine system, you will never get addictive. What it means is the rate of relapse, the rate of becoming dependent is much higher in kids who have an altered response. Well, so now you can take this data set and you can do a lot more with it. You can take kids who have ADD or ADHD and who are medicated for it and give them a dopamine challenge, and that's exactly what we did. So when we take these kids, medicate them, put them on Ritalin or Adderall, bring their dopamine levels back to normal, and then give them an alcohol challenge, it goes up about 930%. In other words, drugs used to effectively manage ADD or ADHD actually prevent the emergence of addiction. But one of the big problems we have is this. If you have a kid who's got ADD or ADHD who is not treated for it, here he is, low dopamine. What do? They self-medicate. Kids who have ADD or ADHD who are not treated, if they drink alcohol, if they smoke pot, will bring their dopamine levels back to normal. It's self-medication. We know, if you just look at the epidemiology, as much as 66% of people who unmask the disease of addiction do so because they're self-medicating another comorbid disorder. In boys, the most common is depression. High school kids, when they get depressed, it's very uncommon, I'm a shrink, it's very uncommon that a 10th grader will come to me and say, I'm depressed, I want to get put on an SSRI. What happens is high school boys smoke or drink, and that self-medicates, and then it unmasks the addiction, the disease of addiction if they have it. Girls, for some reason, it's not depression, it's anxiety. Girls tend to manifest their issues with anxiolytics. So a girl who's anxious will drink, and that alcohol is very much like benzodiazepines, which are what we use to treat anxiety, unmasks the disease. So now we have a much better understanding of not only where to look for the disease, we know what to look for in the disease, we know what age to look, and we now know to look at what other comorbid things that might exist that the kid is self-medicating to treat. Something else goes on that's fascinating. This is a young girl, 2 levels of her brain. So this is about, the top is about the level of her eyes. This is at the level of her ears. So it's a slice like this. So this is a normal PET scan, 2 levels of this young girl's brain. Now she smokes pot. Well, you can see a huge change. The way to think about this is your brain lives on a dimmer switch. The 6-year-old, the dimmer switch was lit up as bright red brain. Smoke pot, slide it down. Brain becomes hypometabolic. So, the classic response to marijuana is to go from a normal brain to a lower or a hypometabolic brain. That's the classic normal response to pot. But what if you start out with a lower brain to begin with? That's a person who's got depression. What if you're depressed to begin with and you smoke pot? Your brain goes back to normal. So here we have the next piece of the puzzle, and that is when you have another comorbid disease like depression or like bipolar disorder, or those are the best 2, and you use an addictive substance, you'll get an opposite, you can get an opposite response. So that says something that's even more important, which is not only is addiction a disease that is unique to a specific neurotransmitter, but it can be unmasked if you medicate another disorder with another addictive drug. And that's a lot of what's going on with kids. So, you can imagine that with this understanding of the disease and what it is and how it works and what the neurochemistry is and when we can see it, when we should look for it, where we should look, we have a whole bunch of people who are looking for other things that cause it. So when I was in medical school back in the dark ages, medical school is 4 years. In 4 years, I had 3 patients die from a drug overdose. That's less than a kid a year. Today, in 2018, we lose 7 kids every hour of every day. So that's 7 times 24, or 168 kids a day from substance abuse. Well, so something's got to be going on, right? So we have all kinds of people out looking. I've heard all kinds of things. I've heard global warming, I've heard Trump, I've heard some comet, you kind of, what the hell's going on? Well, so the thing that's growing very quickly, and it's not a surprise to anyone, is the internet. So just to give you some perspective, if you look at that, I told you the incidence of addiction is about 14%. That's throughout the history of the United States. So call it 250 years plus. So in 250 years, 14% of our population is addicted. In the last 2 years alone, 15% of kids are now reporting addiction to the internet. So we've got more people addicted to the internet in 2 years than we have chemical dependency in 250. So it's not a surprise. I see patients all the time who go through withdrawal when they don't get access to the internet. There's some really elegant studies that have been written on groups of people who lived in the US, young kids who lived in the US and were using the internet and then moved to another country where the internet is much more limited, and you see increases in bipolar disorder, depression, the whole bit. It's clearly something to which people get addicted. It's not a mystery. We can see it happen. I put a kid in a PET scanner and I show them the G from the word Google. You all know what that G looks like. Their dopamine levels go up 80,000 times. So kids get addicted to the internet. It's not a big deal. It's not a surprise. There's been all kinds of papers that show it. it's been reproduced. The million-dollar question is it causal to chemical dependency? And on that one, the jury's out. What we can say is the rate of internet addiction is much faster than chemical dependency. We know that once you get addicted to something, getting addicted to something else is easy, because once you unmask the disease, now it's just which chemical you're going to pick. So we have that data. The thing that always confounds it is when I was in medical school, and I'm sure you've heard it, certainly the parents have, I was always told that if you smoke pot today, by the end of next week you'll be using heroin. Right? They used to say pot was the gateway drug. The data just aren't there. There's no supporting data that says pot leads to other drugs. If you want to look at a gateway drug, the gateway drugs are inhalants. Kids in elementary school who are sniffing, right, whiteout. The number one thing that gets stolen in elementary schools, Sharpies. Kids are snorting Sharpies. Right? Okay, so we were interested in the internet, but something intrigued me 2 years ago when my kids came home. I have 2 kids, 28 and 25. Came home from where they live and spent Christmas with us. And we were sitting at dinner, the 4 of us, and my son passed my daughter something. I don't remember what it was. Potato. And it was odd because they weren't talking to each other. I thought, well, what's going on here? So what do you think? They're texting each other. Right? They're on the same damn table. They're sitting 3 feet from each other and they're texting. Pass the potatoes, pass this, right? So we started to look at cell phone addiction. Now we know that kids get addicted to their cell phones. It's not a surprise, it's no mystery. So what we did was we wrote a protocol up to look at cell phone addiction. And when I wrote the protocol years ago, I had to come up with some time that the kids wouldn't have their phone. What the hell did I know? So I literally picked it out of the air. I said, 2 weeks. I get heroin abusers to give up heroin for 6. I can get cocaine abusers to give up cocaine for half a year. I can get alcoholics to give up alcohol for 2 months. Hell, I can get kids to give up a cell phone for 2 weeks. Guess what? I haven't had a single kid complete the study. Because they can go a day, they can go 2 days. By day 3 or day 4, they're out of it. So we had to change the protocol. So now what we did, instead of looking at abstinence from your cell phone, we did the simple study where we put a kid in a PET scanner and handed him a cell phone. And we saw 120,000% increase in brain dopamine. But you can take it even further. We then took kids and switched the phones. We had the iPhone kids and we had the Samsung kids. And when you put the iPhone kids or the Samsung kids in the camera and you hand them the other phone, no effect. Nothing. If you then take the phone that they use, so the iPhone kids get the iPhone and the Samsung kids get the Samsung, and you take the case off it, nothing. The kids become very tactile to the case and to the weight that their phone is. So we know that kids get addicted to cell phones. We know that we have this issue all the time in schools every day. I've been doing this for 20 years. 15 years ago, the rule was don't even bring a cell phone near the school. Today, I don't know what your rule is here, but I can tell you from my district, you can have your cell phone, you can have it with you, and you can take it out when the periods change. But don't take it out in class. So it's probably just easier to fight the battle of, kids can keep their phone, but they can't take it out, than it was to police them and take it. I mean, back in the old days, we'd have principals stepping on phones. Here's your phone, bang, right? Well, now that they're $1,000. So, cell phone addiction. And we know it, it's obvious, we can see it, we can watch when it happens to a kid, we can watch the process as it develops, we see it in really young kids. We know kids get really addicted, and not just kids, right? I have mine here. I don't go anywhere without my phone, so it's not just a kid. So, that's one of the things that's been fascinating to us, because this new electronic age is, we think, playing an enormous role in the development of, or the transition to, chemical dependence. So, the first chemical study we looked at was a simple one. It was caffeine. Caffeine is the #1 drug of abuse worldwide. Alcohol is #2, not even close. Caffeine is the #1 addictive drug. So, we wanted to do 2 things. We wanted to show kids what the number one cause of relapse is. The number one cause of relapse to drug-seeking behavior are environmental cues. You might know them as triggers. So you go and you talk to a bunch of middle school kids and say, environmental cues are the number one cause of relapse, and their eyes glass over, their head falls back, they don't know what the hell you're talking about. So what we want to do is show them how the environment makes them use a drug again. So what we did was we went out and we got 40 people. The youngest was 16, the oldest was in their 60s. Brought them to our imaging center, no history of drug abuse, and they all signed informed consent to be normal controls, right? We're writing controls of every age. So they all came to the imaging center, signed informed consent. They knew they were going to be normal controls, no history of drug abuse. The only thing I required was they had to like coffee. So I brought them to my center, put them in the camera, scanned them. 2 minutes into their scan, I brew a pot of coffee in the next room. So I've got 40 people, no history of drug abuse, who all of a sudden, I didn't tell them, they can smell coffee. And here's what we get. These are all 40 brains added up. This is a sagittal view of the human brain. Eyes here, you're looking at it like this. This is all 40 people looking right at it. This is 40 people, eyes are here, feet are into the board. Now, remember, I gave them nothing. They got nothing. All they did was smelled something they liked. When that happened, 2 little spots in their brain turned on, and only 2 spots. You only see 1 spot here because it's only half the brain, 2 spots. This part of your brain is called your nucleus accumbens. It doesn't mean, the name doesn't mean anything. What it does, you use it every day. It's a part of your brain that makes you get something you have to have. When you're thirsty, it's what tells you to get water. When you're hungry, it tells you to get food. When you're in a place that isn't safe, it tells you to seek safety. So it's the part of it, it's the oldest, evolutionarily, the oldest part of your brain. A frog only has a nucleus accumbens, which means everything a frog does, it does to sustain its life. We use it to sustain ours. It makes us eat and drink. Well, so what we learned was, whenever you use an addictive drug, and you produce that huge increase in brain dopamine, your brain encodes or learns about everything in the environment where you are. And when you re-experience any part of that environment, this part of your brain turns on and tells you to get the drug. So what I hear the most is music. Kids smoke pot or get drunk listening to music. And then 2 days later, a week later, they hear the same music. There's their cue. They get high with a friend. And 3 days later, they run into their friend. There's their cue. They get high in a basement. They drink at the beach, They get drunk at the beach. The most powerful cause of relapse are cues. Kids get cued. We get cued to everything in our environment when we use a drug. There's a reason that casinos are lights, bells, and tones. There are reasons that when you go to a bartender will put ice in a glass. The clinking sound of ice in a glass is the number one cause of relapse in hard alcoholics. Opening a beer top, a beer bottle, is number 2. So it shows us something we've known, but now we can see. And now we can take it even further. We can now look at the impact of cues. We bring people in and ask them their cues and measure the effect. So we can actually counsel them and say, this cue will do this cue will do this cue will be greater. We can now start to quantitate and get a better picture of the impact of these cues. Well, so then we did the obvious study. We went out and we got 1,200 kids. We brought them to our imaging center on a Monday morning, and we scanned their brain. And there they are. About 1,200 kids' eyes are right up here, normal PET. Then I gave them 1 can of Monster. You all know what Monster is? Monster is like an energy. It's that black can with the 3 green lines. Most kids who drink it drink 3 to 6 cans a day. I gave them 1. They had 30 minutes to drink it, and I scanned them again. And there's their brain. No big surprise. We know that caffeine jacks up the brain. I have a 2-hour commute on the LIE every day. I drink coffee every morning because I want to be on the LIE with a brain like this, not like this. So it's not a surprise. Well, it was a surprise because it's a huge effect. This is normal if you're 6 years old. It is not normal if you're 17. That means nothing makes your brain that active when you're 17. Your brain just doesn't get that active. You use caffeine and it does. Well, so that was, that it went up wasn't a surprise. That it went up as much as it did was a surprise. But the real surprise was we brought the kids back 24 hours later. So we scanned them Monday morning, baseline, monster, scan. Brought them back Tuesday, nothing. And here's their brain. 24 hours later, the effect is still there. Well, that speaks volumes to what we know about every addictive drug. And that is, every addictive drug will change your brain for a lot longer than it changes how you feel. Well, now that speaks to the process of addiction. Once you use an addictive substance and produce a change, if you use the substance again before your brain has time to reset, this disease starts to progress. This effect takes 24 to 36 hours to return. So what does that mean? It's no surprise. I drink coffee every morning. I get to work. My brain's like this. 2.5 hours later, I'm ready for a nap. But my brain's like this. So what does it tell you? It tells you that your brain can't change the physics of the drug. You take an addictive drug, the dopamine's going up, period. What your brain can do is modify how it responds to it. And what do we know in the drug abuse world? We know that's exactly what happens. People have to increase their dose to feel the same effect. Because your brain learns and modifies itself to the feeling that the drug produces, but it can do nothing about the chemistry that the drug produces. So the disease of addiction is one that gets unmasked when you use an addictive substance and progresses when you use that substance in a brain that's already been changed by it. Okay, so this is something else that's going on. When your brain is this active, you have a fence around your brain called the blood-brain barrier. You can think of it as a fence, it's a fence. It keeps things out. I told you I can't give you dopamine because your blood-brain barrier won't let it in. So everybody's got it. It's a fence. It's a very unique fence. But when your brain is this active, that fence starts to leak, becomes semi-permeable. In other words, things can start to get in that normally don't. All that means is if you caffeinate your brain and use another addictive substance, that other addictive substance becomes more addictive than normal. So they made this stuff. You know what Four Loko is? Four Loko is caffeinated alcohol. And the reason they made it, it's very popular, kids know, because you can drink a lot less of it and get more hammered. Because caffeine causes the blood-brain barrier to fail as a consequence of its metabolic rate increase, and more alcohol gets in. So kids are using caffeinated alcohol, and they're able to consume less to get a bigger buzz. And Four Loko was the classic. So just keep it in mind, if you caffeinate the brain and then drink alcohol, alcohol becomes more addictive. So I hear two things. One thing I hear is, thank God I only drink coffee Monday through Friday. I hear that a lot. Well, I don't drink coffee on the weekends, so I can drink alcohol. Remember how long caffeine lasts, 24 to 36 hours. So if you're drinking coffee on Friday and drinking alcohol Saturday night, you still have the effect, right? So, and number two is the number one mixed drink in New York City is Red Bull and vodka. And what kids are able to do is drop the alcohol concentration, increase the amount of caffeine, and get as intoxicated as someone who's just drinking a lot of alcohol. Tobacco. So everybody knows the deal on tobacco. Everybody knows 450,000 people a year die from it, 50,000 secondhand smoke. So what does it do to the brain? Real simple. This is about 4,000 patients on the left. Eyes are right up here. In this PET scan, we're looking at a chemical called monoamine oxidase. It's in the center of the brain in the structure called the thalamus. We all have this chemical in our brain, and it's called monoamine oxidase. Unless you smoke. If you consume a tobacco product, you will destroy 95% of the monoamine oxidase in your brain, period. Not some of you, not most of you, every one of you. This is a dose-dependent, single event process. You consume tobacco, monoamine oxidase goes away. Take a kid who's never done it, here it is. 1 puff in a cigarette, 3 puffs, 1 cigarette, 3 cigarettes. Simple. Simple, dose-dependent, sex-independent boys and girls. So, you consume tobacco, you destroy monoamine oxidase. Now, this is the only effect you'll see tonight that's reversible. It means it comes back. It takes about 55 days, but it comes back. So if you smoke for 10 years and quit, 55 days later, you'll have all you should. If you smoke for 20 years and quit, it comes back. If you're exposed to secondhand smoke, you lose it too. So there isn't anyone in this room who hasn't lost some of this chemicals, because we've all been exposed to secondhand smoke at the least. So now the question is the obvious one: what does it do? Well, I told you when you want to move, your brain has to release dopamine. Well, when you want to stop, your brain has to get rid of it. Your brain needs to make it and get rid of it at the same rate. Because if it doesn't get rid of it as fast, I'll have trouble stopping. So your brain makes it, your brain gets rid of it. This is the chemical that gets rid of it. When you don't have it, you don't get rid of it as fast. That means instead of cocaine raising dopamine levels 200,000%, if you smoke a cigarette and use cocaine, it'll raise it 600,000% and keep it elevated for hours. Well, so that's consistent with what we know about the drug abuse world. As people continue to use addictive drugs and don't have the money to get the dose they use, they preload with cigarettes, and then they can use less of their drug so they get the same high. So, it does something else. Remember I told you the difference between a kid who says he'll do a drug and a kid who said they won't was a dopamine level of about 5%. Well, so let's take all those kids, let's say all those kids live in this district, those are the kids who say they won't do anything, and we send them off to a party. And at that party, we fill the room with secondhand smoke. None of them are smoking, they're just in a room breathing in secondhand smoke. In about 60 minutes, they'll lose all their monoamine oxidase. In 90 minutes, as a direct consequence, their dopamine levels will go up about 5%. Now, all of a sudden, I've taken kids who self-report no willingness to try something novel, who have a normal dopamine level. I expose them to secondhand smoke, and all of a sudden their dopamine level is 5 or 6% higher than when they walked in. So now I have kids who have a dopamine level consistent with those who say they will try something novel. It speaks to what I see and hear all the time. Kids say to me, I don't know why I did it. I've never done it before. I went to this party, and I thought, okay, I'll try ecstasy. We now know that secondhand smoke is the greatest predictor for kids' first experience in an addictive substance in those who report an unwillingness to try them to begin with. So, that became a big issue. Right? Because now we have kids who aren't doing anything, they're just at a party breathing in secondhand smoke and starting to use as a consequence of it. So what did we do? We came up with vaping. So vaping is as old as the hills. Everyone knows what vaping is. I don't think there's any mystery to it. Everyone knows how it works: mouthpiece, battery, cartridge with a heating element. We know there's all kinds of new studies that are coming out. We know juuling is one of the most common things. We have never seen a route of administration of a drug develop as quickly as vaping has. Just to give you something, a sense. The rate of increase, let's do it this way. When you transition from, in the 60s, the heroin that was out there was only about 3 or 4% pure. So if you wanted to get high in the 60s on heroin, you had to inject it. Today it's 95% pure, so you get high snorting it. The amount of time it took to shift, to transition from an IV route of administration to a nasal, inhaled route of administration is basically 40 years. With vaping, we've seen an increase in vaping devices that exceeds that rate by a factor of 10,000, which means kids are vaping faster than they're doing anything else in the history, our history of the drug abuse world. Most commonly, it's happening in middle schools. It's become really common. And remember, we look for things that predict drug abuse. Maybe it's the internet, maybe it's a cell phone. The greatest predictor of illicit drug abuse is vaping. So the numbers we have are, if you take 10 kids who are in 7th grade, 10 kids in 7th grade, none of them vape. By the time they graduate high school, 5 years later, 2 out of 10 of them will be using an addictive drug. That's 20%. If you take 10 kids in 7th grade who vape, 9 out of 10 of them will be using another addictive substance before they get out of high school. It is the single greatest predictor of illicit drug abuse that we've ever seen. So, the question then becomes, you guys have seen all these things, you've seen all the juices that are coming out, the prevalence has gone up 3 times in the last 4 years. The thing that's very disconcerting is now what we've seen as a consequence. Vaping is a very simple physical process. You take a liquid, doesn't matter what it is, and you expose it to a heated piece of metal. That heated piece of metal causes the liquid to vaporize, and that's what they breathe. Well, 6 or 7 years ago, we developed the ability to see nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are small particles, 10 to the minus 9. They're small. Well, now we can see them. 6 years ago, we couldn't. Now we have the technology using X-ray diffraction to see them. Well, so now if you take your vaping device, the vaping devices are made specifically to accommodate size. People don't want to carry around a vaping device that's the size of a school bus. You want to carry around a vaping device that's small, like the size of a USB drive, like a Joule. Well, okay, so that's the first thing you got to design. The second thing you got to design is you got to design the element that's going to heat the liquid. Well, that element's got to heat to a certain temperature. Well, that temperature is going to be generated by the size of the battery, which is going to dictate the metal. Because if I want to heat a completely inert metal like beryllium up, I need a battery the size of a school bus. So I don't want a battery the size of a school bus, I want the size of a thumb drive. So I got to use metal that heats up with a battery the size of a thumb drive. Those metals are nickel, chromium, and cadmium. Those are the 3 metals that are in all vaping devices. When you expose a liquid, it can be Poland Springs water, to a heated metal element, particles of the metal come off. They come off as nanoparticles. It's no surprise. If you take a stainless steel pot out of your kitchen, fill it with water from the sink and put it on the stove and boil it, and put your head over the steam, you're getting nanoparticles of stainless steel. It's no mystery. We know that's what's happening. The thing that's so disconcerting about the vaping are the metals that they use. Number 3, if you go to the OSHA website and you look at metals that cause cancer, number 1 is lead. It's not a surprise. Number 3 is cadmium. Kids are getting huge doses of cadmium. And what we're starting to see is cadmium deposits in kids' livers. Now, the reason it's going to the liver is because the particles are so small. With smoking cigarettes, the carbon that gets in your lung, I see an 80-year-old who smoked when they were 20. Because the carbon's big, it doesn't get out of the lung. That's why there's always so much lung disease. Nanoparticles are small, 10 to the minus 9. Because they're so small, they get through the lung parenchyma, but they don't get through the parenchyma in the liver. So kids who are vaping, and if they're vaping just water, they're getting huge doses of these nanoparticles that accumulate. So what kids need to understand is they're getting exposure to nanoparticles of these 3 metals that will be with them forever. We don't get rid of those metals, they deposit. Right? If you take iron tablets and take too much, you'll get iron deposits in your liver, they don't go away. So, the vaping thing is disconcerting from the point of view that we now have the technology to see the consequence of nanoparticles in kids' lungs and in their liver as a consequence of a vaping device. And the thing that's so difficult to deal with is the kids say to me all the time, but I'm just vaping water. You know, I'm not doing anything else, I'm just vaping. Doesn't matter. Now, the next thing that's happening is in the late 70s, there was a compound called diacetyl. Diacetyl was added to microwave butter-flavored popcorn. And 134 people died from diacetyl. It caused a really nasty lung disease. So the FDA in the early 80s got rid of it. Said you cannot put diacetyl in microwave butter-flavored popcorn. Well, guess where it is? It's in the liquids in Joules. So, they didn't take it out of the liquids, it got put into the juices that kids are vaping. So kids are getting diacetyl in their vaping device, and most commonly, they're not getting it if it's in Poland Springs water, but they are getting it in all the juices. Next, we were hearing some anecdotal reports over the last 5 years of kids who were vaping nicotine were reporting changes in vision. Now, an anecdotal report is nothing more than, you can think of it as a rumor, right? I take a drug and I get a headache, and I say, God, I get a headache when I take that drug. That's not an anecdotal report. I may have gotten a headache because it was Tuesday. It may not be related to the drug at all. So when you hear about anecdotal reports, you listen to them, but you don't put a lot of faith in them because it could be a million things. So we were hearing these anecdotal reports of kids who were vaping nicotine-containing liquids were reporting changes in vision. Well, last year, the New England Journal published a big study that showed that nicotine-containing liquids, to get nicotine to become a liquid, they have to mix it with formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is the compound you use to embalm bodies. Formaldehyde is a retinal toxin. So it made perfect sense that all of a sudden, kids who were vaping nicotine, it's very specific for nicotine-containing vaping fluid, they're getting deposits of formaldehyde in their retina, which causes retinal death. So now the anecdotal reports of changes in vision that we're hearing from kids who vape nicotine have now been confirmed, and we understand why. It's because of the amount of formaldehyde that is unique to nicotine-containing fluids. Alcohol. I don't think there's anybody in here who's not familiar with all the different ways kids are drinking alcohol. Kids tell me all the new stuff every day. This is my daughter's roommate in college. She's doing a classic beer funnel. My son went to SUNY Binghamton, and when he graduated, he lived with a bunch of guys in a house off campus. When he graduated a couple of years ago, he made a 2-story beer funnel. Stood on the roof of his house and had this 2-story beer funnel. He was pouring beer in it, and someone caught the picture, and he was in the front page of the damn paper. You know, Stephen Dewey, SUNY Binghamton student, 2-story beer funnel. So you don't listen to me about how to educate your kid about beer. So this is strike shotgun. I live in the east end of Long Island. Keg stands are really common. My son, when he was in high school, told me he didn't drink. Here he is playing beer pong. I got this off his computer. Everybody knows that there are different ways for kids to consume alcohol, and they're all predicated on getting the dose in fast. In the last 7 years, the greatest increase in route of administration for alcohol is eyeball. It's now the #1 drinking game across college campuses. It's exactly what you think it is. You can go watch 10,000 YouTube videos. Colbert runs them all. And what kids are doing is they're taking clear alcohol, typically gin or vodka. They take the top off the bottle, put their eye on the bottle, and tip the bottle up. Now, our eyes are balls full of water. Aqueous humor, vitreous humor, it's just got a name. It's water. Alcohol and water readily exchange. So when they hold the bottle up, they fill the entire orbit eye with alcohol. And they're getting wrecked. So, a couple of things are going on. First thing you might ask is why? Right, that's a pretty obvious question. What the hell are you doing that for? Well, it's really simple. If you go to a party and you drink alcohol, and you get in your car, leave the party, and drive away, and a cop pulls you over, he gives you a breathalyzer. Most of the alcohol in a breathalyzer is the residual alcohol that's in your mouth that you drank. Well, if you got it into your system by not drinking it, then it reduces the breathalyzer. So the reason kids are doing this is because it helps them not get caught on a breathalyzer. Next, as you would expect, when you look at the incidence of eyeballing across the U.S., the number you see is anywhere between a 4,500% increase and a 7,500% increase. It's difficult to get a handle on that because that's based on whether or not someone tells us about it. Self-reports are always dubious because you don't know if kids are not admitting to it, exaggerating. So the number that we do have that's real is blindness. In the last 6 years, blindness in college campuses has gone up 212%. Kids are losing their sight from eyeball because it fixes the retina. So the kids need to be concerned and aware about eyeballing. The game that's played is a simple game. It burns. So the way the game is played is some kids got a stopwatch and you time it. I've had kids in my ER come in unconscious, LOC, take a piece of paper out of your pocket, it'll say, Michael, 12 minutes, 30 seconds. Billy, 6 minutes, 20 seconds. The game is how long you can keep the bottle up. So we need to educate kids about blindness because it's becoming something that's being reported more and more in the world. The thing that's catching up to this is this. This is no surprise. This has become very, very common. The thing we didn't predict is it's twice as common in boys as it is in girls. It's far more common in boys. And it's exactly what you think it is. And it's done for exactly why you would think. We've been talking about this for almost 2 decades, the eyeballing, because we saw it 20 years ago. And what's happening now is kids are starting to catch on to the visual thing. It's always interesting to me that you talk to them about potential death as a consequence of drug abuse, and that doesn't have near the impact that vision has. Tell them that they might lose their sight, and kids tend to listen more. So eyeballing alcohol, kids are losing their sight. So what happens is, as a consequence of eyeballing, because the specific gravity of alcohol is different than water, when you fill your eye with it, you can't see through it. So kids rarely do both eyes, because then they can't see at all. Well, when kids do just one eye, if you have one, when my kids lived home and they would go out to a party, I'd wait up, and when they came in 2 bloodshot eyes, they'd say, oh, it was smoke at the party, and I'd say, yeah, that makes sense. If your kid comes home with 1 bloodshot eye, it's not smoke at the party. So kids are getting caught. So you want to go to something so you don't get caught. Well, if you tamp, you don't get caught. But the risks are what you would predict. A single exposure in a woman, make her sterile for the rest of her life, 1 time. A single exposure in a male, the colon, alcohol is a drying agent, right? When they put a little alcohol swab on it, it gets cold. It dries your colon. When your colon gets dry, it tears. When you tear your colon, you get something called sepsis. Sepsis is a systemic infection, #1 killer in hospitals. So kids who are tamping, boys who are tamping alcohol are becoming septic, and sepsis is the #1 killer. I think you all know this. This is really common. Talk to any kid in the high school. The reason they like vaping alcohol is because it's the fastest buzz. Alcohol has a low vapor pressure. That means if you heat it with a disposable lighter for a couple of seconds, it comes off as a gas. Kids will take a small glass bottle of alcohol, put a paper cup over top of it, heat the little glass bottle, the vapor fills the cup, you take the cup and breathe it in, and now you're breathing in alcohol. Kids, it produces a buzz within 60 to 90 seconds. The classic period change in a high school is 3 to 4 minutes. So kids can vape alcohol in that 3 to 4 minute period and go from one class sober to the next class drunk. What does alcohol do to the brain? It's very simple. 2 levels of the brain before normal control. You've seen this before. Here's a brain that's intoxicated. The thing that's so striking about this data is there are differences. This gets, you see no reds, so it becomes lower. Slide dimmer switch down. This shuts off. This is your cerebellum. Cerebellum's primary role is balance. If you've ever seen anyone drunk, they don't balance well because this part of their brain shuts off. So, this is a dose-dependent effect. The more you drink, the greater the effect. Sex-independent, boys and girls. The thing that was so striking about this data set was the time course. Remember, with caffeine, it was 24 to 36 hours before your brain returned to normal. With alcohol, it's 5 to 7 days. A single dose of alcohol will change your brain for a week, even though you won't feel it the next day. Consistent with what we know about drug abuse. Drugs change the brain for a lot longer than they change how you feel. So what happens? Kids start with a normal metabolic rate, they drink and it drops. And 5 to 7 days later, it returns. They drink and it drops. And 5 to 7 days later, it returns. Now, if they drink and drop and drink again before its return, they're introducing an addictive substance to a brain that's already been changed by one, and the process starts to advance. Now, as you continue to play this game, you eventually get here. On your left is a 52-year-old male, normal PET scan, eyes are all on top, normal PET. This is a 52-year-old male alcoholic who hasn't had a drink in over 20 years. What happens in the disease of alcoholism is at some point in time, and we can talk about it, at some point in time your brain says, this is my new baseline. I'm never going back to here. This is where I am. Now I'm here. And I'm not going back here unless I drink. This is a 52-year-old male alcoholic who's drunk when I took the picture, and his PET scan's normal. If you ask alcoholics why they drink, the number one answer is they drink to feel normal, they don't drink to get drunk. That's exactly what's going on in the disease of alcoholism. The alcoholic is continuing to drink to self-medicate the consequence of the previous year's exposure. It's why it's so hard to treat. The alcoholic is actually treating him or herself by continuing to drink. At least that's their perception. So what happens? Well, the brain responds because now the brain is used to alcohol, so it adapts to its new metabolic state, but the liver doesn't. So people go into liver failure. The brain can adapt, the liver is far less plastic. So what predicts this? Two things. One is the age of onset when you start drinking. My fourth graders are here already. The younger you are when you start, the sooner it happens. And two, the pattern. If you have a glass of wine every night for 7 days, that's 7 glasses of wine a week. If you have 7 glasses of wine on a Saturday night only, that's 7 glasses of wine in a week. But you binged. Binging brings this on much sooner. And what you see in colleges is kids binge. They don't drink the same amount every night. They'll go several days without drinking and then binge. Now it's Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Pot. We'll cut right to the chase. We didn't have really good data with pot because it's hard to find people who just smoke pot. Well, then we hooked up with people in Colorado. We went out, we scanned 515 kids. Youngest was 14, oldest was 18. Kids who hadn't smoked pot but started. And here they are. And pot does something that is strikingly unique. The last part of your brain to finally grow up is the frontal lobe, the part of your brain in front of above your eyes. It doesn't grow up until you're 24, 25, a year sooner in girls than boys. When you're during adolescence, your brain's growing. If you introduce pot to a brain that's growing, it stops the part that grows. It's really simple. THC is a mitotic inhibitor. If your brain is growing and you smoke pot, then the part that's growing stops. It's really simple, it's dose-dependent, sex-independent, and it's a really unique effect. Kids who are smoking pot during adolescence are arresting the growth of their brain. Now, it's a reversible effect, meaning that if you start smoking pot at 15 and you quit when you're 25, at 25 you have a frontal lobe that's got the synaptic density of a 15-year-old, but it will start to grow, and in 10 years it will catch up. So the thing that's so unique about pot is the greatest effect we see is when most kids start smoking during adolescence. Well, that speaks to the whole nature of this disease. The disease of addiction is one that gets unmasked during adolescence. I don't have people coming to us at 55 saying, I'm an alcoholic, I started drinking 2 weeks ago and I never did anything as a kid. The disease is unmasked during adolescence. One of the most interesting statistics I've ever heard was, if you can avoid using an addictive substance until your frontal lobes are grown up, so avoid using an addictive substance until you're 23 or 24, then the probability of you getting addicted to anything the rest of your life is less than 1%. Kids unmask the disease during adolescence. They don't unmask the disease when they're 40. During the adolescent period is when the disease gets unmasked. It might not show up until you're 50, but you've unmasked it during adolescence because the frontal lobe is the part that gets hit the first. I always put this in here because kids ask me, they tell me all the time. I don't smoke pot, but I go places where people are smoking pot and I breathe in secondhand pot smoke. It does the same thing. K2 is spice. Spice is synthetic pot. It raises brain dopamine, but it does so by depriving the brain of oxygen. So you get an increase in brain dopamine by depriving, by what it's called producing an anoxic event in your brain. Your brain's Achilles heel is oxygen. You can do a whole bunch of things to your brain, but if you deprive it of oxygen, things go south really fast. Spice is the worst drug for producing cell death acutely because it drops your oxygen saturation. Well, when you drop your oxygen, first part of the brain to go is the frontal lobe. When your frontal lobe goes, you become paranoid, confused, and agitated.
Molly. Molly is ecstasy. The kids will tell you, they tell me all the time, ecstasy used to be prescribed. And it did. In the 70s, it was written, there were prescriptions written for it. It was used in young couples who were having marital issues. Because the theory was if we give them both ecstasy, or Molly, they'll open up and talk more, they'll talk more. But it didn't work, but it's in the book as a prescription drug. Molly is a drug that raises brain dopamine, but it does so by killing what are called serotonin cells. These are 3 PET scans. This is a normal control, eyes are on top. This time we're looking at a chemical called serotonin. It's in the same part of the brain as dopamine, but it's also in the brainstem. This is a young kid, 14 years old, who used ecstasy. You can see that the serotonin levels are going away. When your serotonin levels go away, you develop intractable, untreatable depression. 2 weeks after the scan, this kid committed suicide. Here's his brain. This is actual brain tissue compared to normal. This is what serotonin should look like. Here's his brain. Ecstasy is the #1 cause of depression in high schools. Kids who use ecstasy develop acute, chronic, intractable depression. It can't be treated. So suicide becomes their highest incidence. Next, serotonin is the chemical in your brain that regulates your body temperature. You thermoregulate with serotonin. We're all sitting here at 98.6. Well, when you use ecstasy and you kill serotonin cells acutely, you lose the ability to thermoregulate. So what happens? You saw several years ago in Stamford, Connecticut, 14 kids, 7 of them died. Because when you use ecstasy, your core temperature will go from 98.6 to 106. Well, when your core temperature goes up to 106 acutely, you go into cardiac arrest. So kids die from acute hypothermia. So what do? Kids are smart. They know there's 2 things. One, the greatest insulator we have is water. So kids, before they go to parties where they're going to use ecstasy, will preload. They'll drink 2 liters of water. Because if they preload with water, they'll better thermoregulate. 2, they use Vicks. You guys know what Vicks is? Okay, when I was a little kid, my mom used to put that stuff on my chest when I was sick. Every time I have our ecstasy patients come in and they smell like Vicks, I see my mother walking down the hall with this little green bottle of Vicks and a towel. She used to put that crap all over my chest and swear that it made me get better. So kids will cover themselves in Vicks, usually their extremities, because they dissipate heat faster. Cocaine. So this is the classic brain on, this is your brain on drugs, eggs in a frying pan. So here's normal dopamine, you've seen it before. Here's our cocaine abuser 1 month after his last dose. 4 months after his last dose, we've looked at him in 11 years, he looks just like this. Cocaine causes dopamine cell death over years. The classic manifestation is very simple. Parents bring their kids to us and they say, it's my kid, but it's not my kid. And you say, well, what does that mean? And I hear 2 things. He no longer plays Xbox. She no longer dances. Well, it's consistent. If you use cocaine and kill dopamine cells over periods of years, then you drop dopamine levels, you lose the ability to feel pleasure from things that you got pleasure from. And if you got pleasure from playing Xbox and you no longer do, you won't play. And if you no longer get pleasure from dancing, you won't dance. And the other thing I hear is I never see their friends anymore. Well, if you don't like hanging out with Michael anymore, you're not going to hang out with Michael. So it makes perfect sense. The classic cocaine presentation is an age-dependent decrease in brain dopamine that matches self-report of withdrawal, inability to feel pleasure. I don't like things as much as I did. Food taste, I don't eat meat anymore, I don't like sugar anymore. It's a classic dopamine cell loss. Opiates, everybody knows the deal with opiates. Everyone knows that there's what's going on. We know that there's all kinds of treatments. We know the rates increase. We know that 7 kids an hour die. We know that 2 kids an hour, 2 kids every hour of every day are born addicted to opiates. We know what's going on with the opiate deal. We know that in the 60s it was only 3 or 4% pure. Today it's over 94, 95% pure. Most kids today in 2017, 2018 engage in opiate abuse, heroin abuse, first by inhaling it. That never happened before. In the 60s it was injected. That injection actually served as is a big bar to get over to start using, but today, there is no bar because you snort it. Most kids who use heroin, I see thousands a year, report using it first time, snorting it or inhaling it. The heroin metabolic image is a very unique one. This is 4 levels of a normal control brain. This is the top of the brain. This is the bottom of the brain, normal control. Here's our heroin user. What you see is, one, the brain is hypometabolic, but not nearly as hypometabolic as we've seen before. The thing that's so powerful is this blue spot and that blue spot. Those 2 blue spots are a part of your brain called your operculum. All that is a part of your brain. Did you guys see a flash? Oh, good, thank God. Oh my God, I'm starting to lose it. Okay, so it's a part of your brain that allows you to ascribe salience, relevance to things. You do it all the time. You might not think about it, but if asked, you do. When you use an opiate, you become addicted to an opiate, you lose the ability to ascribe salience. All that means is, when I have a heroin user and I say to him, the next dose you take is going to kill you because it has fentanyl. Do you see the prints? It's fentanyl. So you say to them, look, the next dose you get is going to kill you with fentanyl because it's what's killing everybody, fentanyl, not heroin. And what do they say? I don't care. I need my drug. You say, well, look what it's doing to your family. I don't care. I need my drug. The opiate abuser uniquely loses the ability to care about the consequences of what he or she does because their brain no longer allows them to ascribe salience because that part of the brain is shut off. So that's why we have so much trouble with opiate abusers, because the part of the brain that allows them to care about what they're doing or getting treatment for it doesn't work. I'm going to end on this drug. This is the drug that he was making in Breaking Bad. Methamphetamine. It's in every school district. It comes in a whole bunch of colors. In its purest form, it looks like ice, hence the name crystal meth, but it comes in a whole bunch of colors. It's in every district on Long Island. It's become really popular. Several weeks ago, $22 million arrest in a car, 7 pounds of the stuff. I've had it offered to me at a Jets, took my son to a Jets game at a tailgate. A kid walked by with one of those rolling coolers and had 3 synthesis pots running, making it. You just got to get something at CVS and Home Depot and you can make it. It's cheap and you can make lots of it. This is my daughter Brittany when she was 12 years old. This is her brain. You've seen this before, dopamine in 2 spots. When you're 12, there's even dopamine in your frontal lobe. She was 12 when I took this picture. This is a 12-year-old girl who got into methamphetamine in her house and she ate it. And within about 6 months, lost 92% of her brain dopamine. She's blind, deaf, curled up into a fetal position. She's paralyzed. She's fed through a tube, bathed through tubes. Her 6-year-old sister's in the same condition. They used methamphetamine in their house and gave themselves Parkinson's disease. Methamphetamine kills dopamine, gave themselves Parkinson's. My daughter is now 28, and Jennifer is 28. I see her every year. And she will live in a vegetative state the rest of her life because she destroyed all of her brain dopamine. There's nothing we can do. I can't give her dopamine. So she'll live in this vegetative state because she got into methamphetamine. Well, here's the thing that's the most scary. In 2014, every year, we try to bring 200 people into our drug program. 200 marijuana, 200 cocaine, 200 heroin, 200 ecstasy, 200 alcohol. In 2014, we brought in our 200 for pot. Now, we screen the hell out because I can't have a kid who smokes pot and also uses cocaine because I can't interpret the image. So we had our 200 people come in. They signed informed consent. They used pot. And lo and behold, almost 70% of them tested positive for meth. That's unusual. Some lied, there's no question about it, but they didn't all lie. So we actually had them bring their pot to us, and we tested it. And it had methamphetamine in it. Now, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, early up to 2010, 2011, you couldn't find pot that didn't have angel dust in it, PCP. It's just classic, it became a component of it. Pot had PCP or angel dust. Well, not anymore. We now work with the National Institute of Drug Abuse United in Washington, D.C., and we selectively scan and survey pot in what's called the Northeast Corridor. So Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philly, Trenton, New York City, Bridgeport, Providence, Boston. And we go in and we randomly, did I miss one? Not LA. We randomly sample pot. And then, so my sample of 200 is a nothing. 200 is a nothing number. But now we're up to over 9,000 samples, and the number is about 72% that's contaminated with meth. So here's the thing that we now see. Kids who are smoking pot are getting meth. It's very uncommon that they're not. Well, so then you would start to think, well, you know, there are going to be consequences we should pick up. Lo and behold, last year, the group in St. Louis reported on 45 kids between the age of 11 and 14 who showed up with symptoms of Parkinson's disease. You don't get Parkinson's disease when you're 11 years old, unless it's drug-induced. So the thing that we're trying to teach kids now is that the pot that's out there has methamphetamine in it. And if you talk to kids, and I do it every day, kids will say to me, the pot that's available today is much better than the pot from the 60s. The stuff you guys had in the 60s was nothing. The stuff today is really powerful. Well, so you go look at the data. In 1964, the mean number of THC in pot was about 4.82 nanograms. And just remember 4.82. In 2015, the number was 4.96. A little more, but you and I can't perceive it. What's happening is kids are reporting that the pot is better because they think it's the THC concentration, when in fact it's the concentration of methamphetamine. And what's happening is kids are smoking pot with meth, and remember, she ate it. You want to get a drug into your body the most inefficient way to get it in? You eat it. You want to get a drug into your body the most efficient way? You smoke it. So kids who are smoking it in pot are getting much higher concentrations than she got. So I'll end there, answer any questions anybody has about anything I said. And I thank you guys for coming out on is it Thursday? Thursday night. And thank you for having me up here, it's very nice. Does anyone have any questions?
With cell phone addiction,
Yeah.
how do you separate the cell phone itself versus what the cell phone is delivering, which
Right.
is constant contact with my friends, making sure I'm in the social circle so I'm not
Right.
left out. You know, that's what they're getting from
Right.
the cell phone.
It's a good question. So I can tell you what we've done. The only thing that we've been able to do, so the question he asked was, how do you know it's the cell phone and not what the cell phone does? So the first thing that we're able to do is we hand a kid a cell phone that's not on at all. And again, so when the kids come to get scanned, they don't know. They know that they're getting involved in a cell phone protocol, but they don't know what it is. So all they get told is you're coming in, you're getting a baseline scan. So they know, okay. While they're in the scan, I hand them their phone. So the first thing they get is their phone in their hand. That produces about an 80,000% increase in brain dopamine. So that just alone, the unit, does it. Now what we do is we hand them the cell phone with it on, with, I think they use Instagram. You see 140,000% increase. So now you start to get a sense of the instrument itself produces one effect. The use of it, Instagram, produces another effect that's even greater. So the only way we can tease it apart is a kid that and then you play the game with not giving them their own phone. That was the most eye-opening to us. I give them a different phone and it doesn't do anything. It's like I handed them a brick. So they know the tactile component of the phone. They know the weight of the phone. They know the feel of the case that the phone is in. So we know that the physical phone itself plays a role. I can hand them something the same weight that isn't a phone and it doesn't do it. So clearly the physical piece plays a role. When you add Instagram, and I think it was maybe it was Snapchat, I can't. It does something. So you can't really tease it apart. What we can say is they're clearly related. And you can start to look at how kids respond to gaming. So you can have kids who game, and you give them Xbox and they game, and you give them a game they don't like. They'll get a 40,000% increase in brain dopamine. Give them a game they like, and it'll go up to 400,000. So what the game does has a greater impact than the game, but the game has an impact. Anything else? Okay, yeah.
What about the effects of sugar? Like, you don't eat little kids
Yeah.
eat sugar.
So she's asked about the effect of sugar. I should have said, and I didn't. Most of my patients, I study addiction. I don't just study chemical addiction, I study all kinds of addiction. most of my patients are obese. The greatest addiction to anything is sugar, right? So people who are obese are addicted to food. I can take personally, we do the studies all the time. Bring someone in who's overweight, ask me what food they like, they tell me, I hand it to them, their dopamine levels go up 40,000 times. I hand me a Brussels sprout, I get sick, but hand them something they don't like and it doesn't change. So sugar that's why we have this issue with addiction, because it's one thing to sit there and say, if you don't have an addictive, if you don't take anything that's addictive, until your frontal lobe grows, you won't get addicted to anything. Every kid has sugar. So that's where it fails. It doesn't fail because kids are smoking pot in 7th grade. It fails because kids are getting exposed to sugar, which produces a dose-dependent increase in brain dopamine. But you can't, so that's the thing that triggers most. But how do you prevent that? Yes?
Where do they get the vaping products, like the liquids that they can?
Where do they get the what?
The vaping liquids.
Amazon.
Amazon.
Or the corner deli. Really? There's a reason I don't come upstairs.
Yeah, we got to move it to the back, but they've got.
We have vaping shops in strip malls. But most kids will get it, because I think there's some restriction on age. But I think
No,
Amazon, right? You can get,
Amazon.
I know the kids tell me they get it on at Amazon. They buy their jewels at Amazon. Yeah. Yes?
They target kids. There is a vaping place in Carmel that I pass. And just the name of the business or the sign, it looked like it was a place for kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest thing that concerns, I've been in the business 40 years and I've never seen anything so popular in such young kids. I mean, when I go to elementary schools, people will hand me jewels. We've got to get these out of here, we confiscated them. Right, there's been a big thing, there's a big thing in districts down on the island where kids caught with the devices are getting 5 days of OSS. So it's becoming so common that classrooms are being suspended because so many kids are vaping. Now they've come up with ways to sense vapes in bathrooms. Right? I've seen they take doors off of bathrooms. Right? Yeah, they absolutely target kids. There's no question. Yep. Okay, well, thank you guys. Thank you very much.